I was supposed to be the one center stage that morning. I'd worked for this in every quiet hour between shifts. 2 jobs, a scholarship application that felt like navigating a maze blindfolded, nights where my laptop hummed louder than my neighbor's TV. I finished my master's in accounting with a wildfire of relief and a spreadsheet-level obsession with detail. Every internship, every cup of instant coffee, every subway ride piled up into this single, ridiculous moment where I would put on a gown and be allowed to say the word graduate out loud without it sounding like a dare. I planned the day like it mattered, because it did. I booked a small table at the little Italian place near campus where the bread basket is worth the price of admission. I borrowed my friend Jade's camera so I wouldn't end up with a dozen awful phone selfies. I ironed the white shirt that would peek out beneath my gown and folded my hood with the kind of care someone gives a fragile artifact. When I said surprise in the text to my parents, I meant it with all of the performative joy you save for a life milestone, the kind of speech about support and small sacrifices and how you didn't quite manage to cry because you were too proud. My mother's name is Sarah. My father is Tom. They grew up in a small town where the main economic activity was grit and mutual assistance. And they taught me to fix things, to argue facts politely, to never spend money before you count it twice. They told their friends I was going to Harvard for my master's, when really I went to the state school 2 towns over, and they did it like they were buying me a crown. I loved that about them. I loved them. The text arrived at 9:12 a.m., while I was steaming my gown over the bathroom sink because the campus ceremony was outdoors and the forecast was mercilessly earnest. The little bubble appeared against the background of my checklist. I read it once. Hey, babe, guess what? We're going to skip the ceremony. Super Bowl's at Uncle Rick's this year. Party at 1. Then again, slower, as if that would rearrange the facts. I had spent the night rehearsing how I would be generous about it. I pictured them ducking into the restaurant 20 minutes late with nacho-smudged smiles, me pretending I hadn't noticed. I pictured my dad snapping blurry photos and my mom insisting the photographer take the family shot twice because someone blinked. Instead, my phone vibrated like a small, indifferent animal, and the world condensed to the size of a notification bubble. There was the obvious irritation, the audacity of a televised game outranking a life milestone. But the real pain was smaller and more precise. The idea that the people who had promised to show up for every boring parent-teacher conference, every chemistry fair, would skip the one thing I had literally worked toward for years. It was a question about what my successes were worth in their ledger. It was, in a way, a ledger I thought I had read correctly. I closed the message, smoothed my borrowed hood with fingers that remembered every unpaid invoice I'd balanced, and walked out to the quad where caps bobbed like a bright, ridiculous flotilla. My smile felt practiced and thin. My throat held a small, private anger. What I carried to that field wasn't only a diploma. It was the expectation of being celebrated by the people who taught me how to count. That expectation, for the moment, had been quietly subtracted. After the caps and confetti came down, life slid back into its ordinary grooves. Take the bus, grade the entries on my internship log, answer emails that expected miracles by Friday. I told myself the graduation day wound would scar over. It didn't. It changed shape into something else, a quiet, steady irritation I could feel whenever my parents called. A few weeks later, I went by their house with takeout because I still believed in small rituals. Tom opened the door in a paint-spattered sweatshirt, the smell of turpentine and something fried clinging to him. Sarah was at the kitchen table with a cigarette stubbed out in an ashtray and a stack of business cards splayed like a fortune teller's deck. "Kira?" she said, pleased, proud in the way people are when they've staged a reveal. "Come see what we've got going." Their side hustle turned out to be a renovation outfit, Tom's Trades, plastered on magnetic signs and bumper stickers. It had the kind of confidence you buy at the hardware store, a laminator, a cheap website, and a cousin who did the drywall. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the name because Tom had a voice that loved to be heard. They were so buoyant about it, so plainly convinced this was upward mobility that the first thing I felt wasn't suspicion but relief. They seemed to have something stable. Maybe that was all I wanted for them. Then Sarah nudged a battered laptop toward me and said, casual as folding napkins, "We thought, since you're an accountant and all, you might look the books over, just to be sure." She said it like she was asking for a favor, like saying yes would be a shared joke between us. I tried to smile the way you do when your work and your family intersect politely. I opened QuickBooks with a thrum in my chest that felt professional and protective at once. The interface was familiar. Little boxes waiting to be populated with truth. The truth, it turned out, was messy. I found invoices issued to people I didn't recognize and deposit slips that matched no vendor records. There were reimbursements for materials that transferred into a personal account in Tom's name, expenses dated Sundays when the crew was supposedly on jobs, and line items labeled miscellaneous that were anything but. A handful of bills were paid by prepaid debit cards with no names attached. I noticed the same invoice number used more than once, with amounts that changed as if someone had been adjusting a thermostat. Red flags have a way of arranging themselves into a pattern if you look long enough. A subcontractor's invoice had a P.O. box and no tax ID. An envelope of cash had been logged as supplies. An apparent client, a management company, had an address that tracked to a mailbox in a strip mall. Little algebraic lies multiplied into a larger one. Money pledged to projects that seemed to vanish into family accounts. The simplest explanation was that the books were sloppy. The worst was that they were deliberate. I pushed my glasses up my nose, a learned, useless gesture, and said carefully, "Do you have copies of the contracts? Who are your clients on file?" Tom shrugged and smiled like it was a shrug and a smile could hold back consequences. "Oh, a few here and there. We do favors. You know how it goes." Sarah laughed, the sound of someone deflecting. "We're doing fine, Kira. Don't worry your pretty head with it." Their faces looked like the same parents who had taught me to check and double-check a sum. I wanted to be understanding. They were proud, they were trying, and in some ways, they were managing more than they had before. But the accountant in me fitted pieces into a pattern I couldn't unsee. Sloppy record-keeping invites questions. Creative bookkeeping invites trouble. When I named specific inconsistencies, duplicate invoice numbers, deposits to non-business accounts, vendors with P.O. boxes, their defensiveness folded out like a map. "You're being paranoid," Tom said, and his voice was the kind that comes with beer and certainty. "We've earned this. You should be proud." Sarah put a hand on his arm and smiled the smile that softens friction into family lore. They were the underdogs who'd made it. They meant it. I heard the story they wanted to be true and felt the story I knew, a pattern of cutting corners, rationalized by small-town scrappiness and the kind of moral shortcuts that look like survival from the inside. They asked me to just keep an eye on things. It sounded harmless, even affectionate. I wanted to refuse outright, proudly separate myself from the moral spill. But the request had the texture of obligation, and family obligations have a gravity law of their own. I told them I would look, which was really saying I would watch, and watch I did. The watching pulled at me like a loose thread in a sweater. It at first only irritated the surface, then threatened to unravel things I'd thought stable. That night, I lay awake replaying entries in my head, tallying little lies until they aggregated into a nightmare. The ledger on their laptop had become an argument I couldn't fold into a conversation without precise words. Every time my phone buzzed with a "How's it going?" from Tom, the annoyance thinned into worry. I started catching ways they framed the business. We had to get creative. That made my skin go cold in a way numbers never should. Frustration settled in like a second job. It was quiet and persistent, and it smelled faintly of oil and coffee, and the truth that sometimes the people who taught you to count are the ones who miscount you. The seed of doubt was planted, and it would not be content merely to sit there. The first envelope came in the kind of heavy, official paper that feels like a physical elbow to the ribs. It was a certified letter from a collections agency, the return address a town 3 hours away. The sight of my name on the front should have been ordinary. Instead, it landed like a joke with the punchline missing. Inside, a notice for a business line of credit I had never applied for, maxed out, interest piling like snowdrifts. Below it, a small line in bureaucratic type. Authorized signer, Kira M. Carter. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with math. I ran my thumb over the signature block on the copy attached and felt that cold animal recognition. Whoever had signed my name did it with an ease I reserve for grocery lists. Someone had used me as a guarantee. Someone had used my credit to buy materials that were labeled as supplies and then siphoned out into accounts that belonged to, among others, Tom Carter. The second hit came in a squeal of a phone call from the university's financial aid office. "Kira, we need you to clarify some income reported under your name for last tax year," the woman said, gentle and clipped like someone announcing bad weather. "It looks like there were contractor payments, and the IRS has questions." There is a particular acute nausea that comes with realizing your paper life, your credit, your tax history, kleshmers, your legal existence, has been rearranged by someone else. That night, I slept in a dress, the gown's satin snagging at my skin, thinking about how intimately my life was recorded in ink and numbers and signatures. I went back to their laptop and pulled the audit trail like someone checking for fingerprints. The trail was a mess of logins at odd hours, an occasional remote access entry with an IP traced to a cafe mile from my parents' house, and, most damning, a PDF of a bank application with my name and my supposed signature visible on the screen. I moved through the house like a detective in a domestic film. Paint cans lined the garage. A stack of receipts sat on the kitchen counter like a confession. I asked for explanations, for the simple, ordinary thing. Truth. Tom said he could fix it. Sarah said they had been desperate. Both said they had no idea how it could have happened. Neither looked me in the way people look those they have done wrong to. No shame, only the preening discomfort of being caught in a story they could not fully stage manage. When I pressed, the conversation mutated into something else. "You should have watched the books better," Tom said, and the sentence landed with the precise cruelty of a legal judgment. "You're the accountant in the family. You showed up with your nose in your books while we were getting this business off the ground." His voice was equal parts wounded and cold. Sarah folded her hands like she was at a funeral and said, "We raised you. We gave you everything. We're a family. We do what we have to do." There is a move people use when they want to make someone the villain while remaining the victim. They recast the harm as a test the other person failed. Being framed felt like that. Less a criminal act in their telling than an accounting error I had somehow enabled by attending grad school, by expecting courtesy, by having boundaries. I went to the bank the next day. The teller was sympathetic and bureaucratic. She showed me photocopies of an application, a handful of checks, a notarized change of address form that listed my mother as my contact. The handwriting on the notarized form was not mine, but the notary's stamp was real. Whoever did this had thought ahead to paperwork. Whoever did this had, preferentially, used my name because it was clean. A steady credit score, a quiet email address, a name that had enough professional cachet to make lenders less suspicious. When I called Tom, his voice was flat. "We're family," he said. "We didn't want you to worry. We were trying to protect the business." I told him the business wasn't being protected so much as laundered through me. I told him the collections letter said I owed tens of thousands. He said, "Then we'll pay it back. We'll sort it." The words were soft as gauze, but hollow. It didn't stay hollow for long. A week after the bank visit, I received an email flagged from the state auditors. They were looking into Tom's trades. As Kira M. Carter, I was listed as the company's accountant and one of its principal officers. My name, in 3 different databases, had been inked into responsibility without my knowledge. The betrayal settled into me in practical ways I had not expected. Loan offers vanished like miracles reversed. The certified letter meant my credit was toast until disputed. Scholarship committees asked for clarifications. Employers called to ask why contractor invoices showed up under my SSN. Each call felt like a tiny extraction from my life, a pulling loose of threads I had woven painstakingly through years of economy and discipline. When I went home to say everything had to stop, that if they didn't come clean, I would have no choice but to take legal steps, Sarah put an arm around my shoulder and said, "You're making this worse." Tom's mouth turned into a short, practiced smile. "You owe us gratitude," he said. "All this education isn't cheap. You know that." They had turned the very thing they used as cover, my degree, my reliability, into an accusation. I had been too free to leave, too easy to step outside the family ledger. What they did after that was the most precise knife. They took the moral high ground. They played the aggrieved parents. They told mutual friends I had been ungrateful, that I had abandoned them the day I put on that cap. A cousin I barely knew called to ask why I was throwing the family under the bus. The town's sympathy condensed into a single, colder thing, an expectation that I would fold, apologize, and fix what they had broken. I packed a duffel bag and left before the weekend. I couldn't stand the way they looked at me. Not like a daughter, not like a thief, but like someone who had to be made to understand her place in the family balance sheet. I slept on Jade's couch that night, the upholstery smelling faintly of coffee and optimism. I left a note for Sarah and Tom, words that tried to be straightforward, about the facts, about my intent to clear my name. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't want reconciliation yet. I wanted breathing room. What felt like betrayal at first had mutated into something larger, a deliberate use of my life as collateral. They hadn't simply cut me out of a ceremony. They drafted me into a scheme that could ruin me. The wound was deeper than being stood up at a restaurant. It was the quiet, grinding theft of agency. It would require more than anger to set right. I didn't want theater. I wanted paperwork that could not be smoothed over with a shrug or a sob. Revenge for me was a stack of undeniable things: stamped bank statements, matching invoice numbers that contradicted job site photos, vendor lists that led to P.O. boxes instead of licensed contractors, and a trail of petty, persistent deceit that could not be blamed on creativity or by the fog of good intentions. I spent the first week like a rat in archives. Late nights in Jade's kitchen, fluorescent light above us, 2 mugs of coffee that tasted like alarm clocks. I printed everything twice. One set I redacted ruthlessly, social security numbers, client emails, because I wasn't trying to burn anyone more than necessary. The other set I kept pristine, each paper a little accusation. I wrote a cover letter that was not angry. Anger is ornamental, and the people who wrong you don't always read ornament. I wrote facts, dates, account numbers, unauthorized use of personal credit and identity theft, I wrote, because naming a thing makes it harder to deny. I filed an anonymous tip with the State Fraud Division and a whistleblower submission with federal tax authorities. I opened a secure email and sent the redacted packet to an investigative reporter at the only paper in town that still did actual reporting. Small papers have big teeth when the town is the story. I called my bank and filed fraud claims, demanding freezes on accounts that had my signature attached like a ghost. I walked into the local police station and reported identity theft. I did every boring, legal thing that makes an honest life defensive and strong. If it sounds clinical, that was part of the point. I'd learned to respect process, because process is what keeps numbers honest. I let it work. The state asked questions. The bank put holds. The reporter asked for a comment. I declined. The first domino fell quietly. A summons to Tom's Trades for an audit that read like a polite punch. Please provide documentation for all materials and subcontractor payments for the past 2 years. The second domino clattered louder. The bank called Tom in for clarification and left a voicemail with an urgency that smelled like ice water. I did not gloat. Gloating is a luxury that belongs to people whose revenge causes no harm beyond pride. Instead, I watched the consequences as a scientist watches an experiment, with fascination and a small, necessary sorrow. The auditors found more than the initial packet suggested: vendors without licenses, checks written to cash, a subcontractor who couldn't be found because he was a name on a spreadsheet. The tax people followed the money, and what they found were thinly veiled transfers into private accounts and personal credit lines opened in my name. The reporter ran a piece with those redacted packets as the spine. The headline was small-town brutal. Local contractor under investigation after allegations of fraud. Graduate's name used as guarantor. Uncle Rick called my mother at 1 p.m, during the big game. I found out later, from a friend who texted screenshots of the live paper article, that the Super Bowl party went quiet when phones started buzzing. Tom told everyone it was a mistake. Sarah cried on the couch and then got angry enough to call it persecution. They invited me to come home and explain, like I'd been invited to reconcile a crossword puzzle. I did not go. A week later, at a time I chose not to be present for, a team of auditors and officers arrived at Tom's Trades. They didn't burst through the front door like villains in a movie. They carried clipboards and wore shoes that made no noise and asked for ledgers calmly. They photographed bank reconciliations. They tagged equipment, and with a procedural thriftiness that felt inexorable, they placed a notice on the office door. Operations suspended, pending investigation. The truck with Tom's Trades across the tailgate was towed the following morning. I watched the tow truck's arm lift the vehicle in a picture my cousin sent with no caption, because captions seemed unnecessary. Justice was not theatrical. It came like a municipal truck and the hum of fluorescent lights being switched off. I felt a small, precise release when I saw that first notice on the office door. It was not the sight of my parents being humiliated that settled me. It was the settling of a ledger, the things that had been misallocated. Trust, credit, responsibility were being retabulated by systems I had trained myself to respect. There was a moment I will not pretend I didn't enjoy, when a mutual friend, tipped by the paper, asked if I'd been the one to send the packet. I let the silence do the work. The rumor folded into the town like a small, sharp coin. People counted it and changed how they treated my parents at the hardware store. I received one terse email from Tom that said, simply, "You did this." It read like a diagnosis. I did not celebrate at their expense. There was grief, always, under the satisfaction. The inconvenience of auditors is a kindness compared to the collapse of a family myth. When accounts were frozen and invoices stopped being paid, creditors came knocking in ways that were practical and unsentimental. I had not wanted their lives ruined. I had wanted them to stop using mine as a slush fund. The difference is a moral chasm some people can't cross once they've decided their ends justify every means. The climax, therefore, was not a courtroom sermon or a dramatic arrest on a front lawn. It was invoice after invoice laid bare, signatures that didn't belong traced back to the hands that had used them, and the slow administrative certainty of agencies that do not care for narratives, only for evidence. The town watched. The paper wrote. The agencies acted. My name was unmoored from their misdeeds, and slowly I watched my credit reports begin the long, medicated healing of corrections. When it was over in a legal sense, when subpoenas had been issued and the business's accounts were frozen, the Super Bowl reruns played on someone's living room TV while an empty parking lot told the rest of the story. My parents were left with the sober parts of consequences. Calls to collectors, the awkwardness of friends who felt they had to choose sides, and the knowledge that their small-town story about doing what had to be done would be repeated now with a different moral. I left the final note off my list of triumphs. My revenge was precise and, I told myself, necessary. I had not wanted to be the instrument of ruin, only the instrument of accountability. The ledger closed, not with fireworks, but with a file stamped by the state and a headline that had finally attached truth to my name. I slept that night on Jade's couch and felt, for the first time in months, my breath unburdened by the weight of a borrowed signature. They say you build a life out of what shows up for you. The week after the auditors left, I moved in for good with Jade and Marcus. Their apartment above the roastery smelled like cinnamon and hot metal, and the mildew-sweet optimism of people who had stubbornly decided to make something honest. Jade, who'd lent me the camera for graduation and the couch the night I fled, handled marketing and mysterious latte art wizardry. Marcus was the grinder, the logistics brain who could turn a farmer's timetable into a shipping calendar without breaking a sweat. I brought what I had left that was useful: meticulousness, a knack for finding where numbers hid, and a refusal to let other people gamble with my life again. We turned the roastery into a real business, the way you turn a hobby into a job, with lists, with small, brutal meetings at midnight, and with spreadsheets that felt almost obscene in their intimacy. I set up proper payroll, separated personal and business accounts, implemented inventory controls that made Marcus squeal in delight, and taught them about margins in the way you explain physics to someone who loves explosions, patiently, with diagrams. We started selling subscriptions. We walked into the Saturday farmer's market with a crate of beans and a printed menu and the kind of awkward pride that feels like courage on two legs. The first time someone said, "This was worth the price," I cried charging the card reader and blamed the humidity. The work was different from the revenge I'd engineered. Quieter, less satisfying as spectacle, but it had a sturdier pleasure. When a vendor called about a missing pallet, I didn't panic. I reconciled the manifest and found a transcription error. When a barista balked at reconciling a till, I handed a coffee and a rubric and watched competence bloom. The moral math of it was simple. Make things transparent, keep promises, pay people on time. We became the sort of small business people admired, not because we were flashy, but because we were reliable. That felt like a higher kind of victory. My parents called twice in that first month. The first time, Tom left a message that sounded like a man practicing regret into a pocket-sized recorder. Words clipped. Careful. "Kira, can we talk?" he said. The second time, Sarah sent a long, roundabout email that tried to explain desperation as if it were a character in a play. I read both on my phone in the morning light while grinding espresso and felt the old ache. I did not answer immediately. I wrote a concise reply a few days later. I would consider mediated conversation through a lawyer. I meant it. Boundaries, I learned, are a practical kindness you owe yourself. People sometimes imagine revenge as a final, noisy stroke. My version was quieter and better suited to my temperament. Accountability followed by creation. The roastery, with its paper receipts and honest invoices, became my answer to the ledger they'd distorted. I liked reconciling a balance sheet the way other people liked finishing a painting. There was a completion that felt almost spiritual. When customers left 5-star reviews about the cinnamon notes or our finally stable subscription boxes, I felt stitches closing in me that had nothing to do with public embarrassment and everything to do with integrity restored. There were moments of real grief. I missed the easy parts of being a family. The bad jokes at Sunday dinners, the way Tom could fix a leaky sink without swearing, the small, embarrassing pride Sarah took in my smart shirts. Those memories lived alongside the evidence of what they'd done, and the two things did not cancel each other out. They sat in the same room like people who'd been through an argument and come back with different souvenirs. I let myself be sad about what had been lost without pretending the loss was accidental. On the following Super Bowl Sunday, we hosted a small open house at the roastery. There were mismatched chairs, a projector that showed the game in fuzzy glory, and a spread of pastries Jade had procured like contraband. Marcus roasted a seasonal blend he'd called Second Wind. Friends came, old classmates, customers, people who'd watched our growth on social media. My parents did not come. No one dramatized that absence. It felt like a plain fact, like rain, and the day proceeded. Laughter, coffee, the weird communal silence that comes when everyone is invested but nobody is pretending. When the game ended and the lights came up, I stood by the bags of beans and felt something that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with being exactly where I was supposed to be. I'd gone from a graduation ceremony that my family missed to a small business that had my name on its payroll and my friends on its masthead. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not theatrical. It was procedural and slow and necessary. Peace, when it arrived, was not the sealing of a wound, but the steady warmth of people showing up. I kept my ledger open and honest, and in the columns I found a new kind of balance. The kind you get when you build a life with people who actually show up.